in a minute, we're going to, well, we just talked about, darshana, getting a vision or a glimpse of God, and maybe being seen by God. But I assume that we've all watched the 330 Million Gods video. But I think it's time to get a little bit more close up and personal with some of just to get a picture of how some of these important gods, some of the more important deities are pictured. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, I pulled all this information I'm about to talk about from these websites here. One of my favorite places is anything that's written by the Four Dummies. There are bunches of books and stuff out there, and so there's a book out there called Religion for Dummies. I have it here somewhere. It's very, very simple. It's really handy. It's just really, really basic stuff. And they actually have a website, and I found a really good some pictures and descriptions of some of the Hindu gods and goddesses. And there was also another website, Ancient History Lists, and Ancient History Lists. Well, there are two different ones that I use. One for basically some of the gods and some about 10 Hindu goddesses. So this is everything I'm showing you here is from these various links on the internet. So if you want to go in and dig it in, so dig it up. All right, let's move on here. So the first deity I'm going to take a peek at. Now, this is not Brahman. Brahman can't be pictured, can't be known. Brahman is being, not a being, right? But this is Brahma, the creator, usually referred to as Lord Brahma. Now, when I first started learning about Hinduism in an academic class, I was confused between this Brahma, who's the creator, created the universe, creates the world, and Brahman. And it took a little while before I actually began to understand them as distinct. Anyway, but this is not Brahman, it's just a similar sounding word. Just like there's the caste Brahmin, which is not the ultimate God, but it has this same basic root. So anyway, this deity, Brahman, is the creator. He's and frankly, he's not worshipped very much in India today. You won't find a temple that is dedicated to Lord Brahma, the creator, even though, I mean, that's a pretty important role to create the universe. But because basically he's semi-retired. He's created the universe. Now, periodically, the universe is destroyed and has to be created again. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So he's basically on sabbatical right now. So what's the point of relating to him? There's really nothing he can do for you. So there's not a whole lot of focus on him. But anyway, he is important, and he's the first member of what's often referred to as the Hindu Trinity, the three of the most important gods out of the 330 million gods. This is actually known as the Trimurti, which we'll see in a couple of minutes. But in this group of three gods, we actually see creation, preservation, and destruction in their roles. And this is kind of something that goes on and on. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, so Brahma is the first member of this Trinity and is the creator because periodically he recreates everything in the universe. And periodically here refers to the Hindu belief that time is cyclical. Everything in the universe except for Brahman is created and maintained for a certain amount of time and then destroyed in order to be renewed in ideal form again. In other words, it kind of gets messed up in use and it needs to be, rehabbed, completely rebuilt. That's his job, important job. So you'll hear a lot about Brahma in Hinduism. Now, this is the one we've already mentioned. This is Vishnu, who is known as the preserver. Vishnu is a second member of this Trimurti, this Trinity. He maintains the order and harmony of the universe. So Lord Brahma creates the universe, and now Vishnu is the one who keeps it in working order, keeps it in balance, and keeps it in harmony. So this universe is periodically created by Brahma and periodically destroyed by Shiva, who we'll see in the next minute. So between Brahma and Shiva are all the responsibilities of Vishnu. This is one of the reasons when I mentioned Advaita Vedanta, it talks about Vishnu being the best bridge, because Vishnu is really the most present of deity, without getting lost in all because so Vishnu is worshipped in many forms and in a number of avatars. Now, an avatar is basically an incarnation of a god in some sort of form, where the god takes on incarnation. It would be enfleshment. It doesn't have to be a human being. There are 10 major incarnations of Vishnu where, for instance, just to give you an idea of what this is like, if you've seen the movie Avatar, which is coming out in the theaters again soon, and I think there's going to be another new Avatar as well, that kind of use the story, but that's the story, that's this fictional story, this fantasy story that takes place, in the future, in some distant planet, where we as, humans visit this planet, and it's inhabited by these people called the Navi, and these beings called the Navi. And what the humans do is they basically transfer their consciousness to bodies, the Navi bodies that they created, so they can interact with them. It's like, if you want to, go talk with a fish, well, you've got to be a fish, right? So the idea is Vishnu takes on human form or forms where it's easier to relate to them. So the Hindus view Jesus as an avatar of God the Father. And, that's what Christianity basically says, is that Jesus is God in the flesh, the God-man, right? So that's the concept of an avatar, right? Is the God becoming human or taking on some sort of body that we can encounter. We'll see some of these avatars in just a minute of Vishnu. Vishnu is an important, somewhat mysterious God. What God isn't mysterious, but anyway, but he's very mysterious. He's less visible than the nature gods that we'll see some of, that preside over the elements like fire and rain and wind and the sun and the moon and that type of thing. Vishnu is the pervader, the divine essence that pervades the universe. He's usually worshipped in the form of an avatar. So let's take a look at some of these. Two of the most famous avatars, and the word avatar literally means descent. That comes from the word to descend. So it's usually understood to be divine descent. Avatars are savior forms of a god that descend to earth to intervene whenever help is needed. So they restore the dharma, the moral order and peace to the earth. And two of Vishnu's, because that's what Vishnu does, right? He's the preserver, right? He preserves everything, restores order and balance. So two of Vishnu's 10 avatars are Rama and Krishna. Probably you've heard both of those names before. Certainly Krishna. There's probably not anybody anywhere who hasn't probably heard about this god Krishna. But he is actually an incarnation, an avatar of Vishnu. Let's talk about Rama first, the one on the left here, who's very blue. Man, I like it. Blue's my favorite color. So anyway, so Rama is one of the most beloved Hindu gods, and is the hero of the Hindu epic, which is part of their sacred writings, known as the Ramayana. He's portrayed as an ILD. Let me get my lips and my tongue in sync here. He is portrayed as an ideal son, brother, and husband. He's also portrayed as a king and as a strict adherent to dharma, to duty, to destiny, to the rules of life. Millions of Hindus derive satisfaction from reading and recalling Rama's trials and tribulations as a young prince who was exiled from his kingdom for 14 years. The Ramayana is quite an epic tale, and it's definitely worth the investigation, the read. Then there's Krishna, the cute one on the right here. Now, obviously, he was young. He looks like a little toddler here this way, but if there's one Hindu god's name who is known and recognized throughout the world, it is Krishna. Hindus identify Krishna as the teacher of the sacred scripture called the Bhagavad Gita. You may have heard of, or some of you may have even read parts or even had it assigned as in a course to read the Bhagavad Gita. I actually read it in high school. It was assigned in a high school English class, literature class. So it's a fascinating story. It's very popular. It is the most popular part of all of the Hindu sacred writings is the Bhagavad Gita. And so Krishna is the teacher that is basically relaying the story that's found there. He is also the friend and mentor of Prince Arjuna, who is the hero, the main character in the epic, the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata is 750,000 verses or sentences. It is the longest piece of literature in the world. It's a huge story. And both the Ramayana, which are mostly about, where Rama is one of the main stars, and the Mahabharata, where Krishna is a significant player, are the two parts of the scriptures that are very much a part of popular Hindu life and culture. As a matter of fact, movies and TV shows and all this type of stuff is made about these stories in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. When I lived in Singapore in the late 1990s, I was teaching at two graduate institutions, two seminaries in Singapore. I was primarily teaching world religion and teaching how to read biblical Hebrew. And I also taught some courses, other courses that were related to different things. I taught some New Testament courses and different things like that. But anyway, while I was there in Singapore, which has a population of around 5 million people, on a tiny island that's 15 miles by 30 miles. So it's a city state. It's probably the most densely populated place on the earth, but it is extremely highly technical and advanced civilization. And I mean, modern skyscrapers and it's the most modern place on earth. It's just an incredible place to live. But anyway, while I was there, most of the people who live there are their families originally came there from China. The British basically imported the Singaporeans to basically, you ever heard the phrase Shanghaiing somebody? In the 1700s and the 1800s, you could be shanghaied and basically, captured and made a sailor, and you had to serve on a sailing ship. And the British did a lot of this. And Shanghai is on the coast of China, and that's where they went to get a lot of their laborers. They would literally Shanghai them That's where it comes from, where it comes from, and basically enslaved them, not in chains, but, they would round them up and move the men only. They moved the men only to Singapore, which was a tropical island that was basically only inhabited occasionally by some pirates who only stayed there long enough because they had a great natural port, a great natural harbor. And so anyway, the pirates would only last there a little while. Nobody could stay there because the mosquitoes were so bad. You'd die of dengue fever or malaria or something like that. It was horrible. It was a horrid place to be. But the British wanted the use of that natural harbor for their trade routes. And so they brought in laborers to work the docks who were from China, and males. And then eventually those males, then they brought over, they shanghaied a bunch of females to, that's just the way history happens, to basically, so the males would have somebody to mate with, and they basically put them in brothels. And then eventually, you have families developing. And so, not an auspicious beginning, but by the 1960s, Singapore gets its independence from the British Empire. And so most of the population is Chinese, even though it's literally a quarter of a mile off the coast of Malaysia. And Malaysians are not Chinese, and just a few miles from one of the islands of Indonesia. So but the population is 80% Chinese because they were basically brought there to work and later begin to families. So and about 10%, maybe 11% of the population are people who've recently come here, or in the last 100 years come there from India to work, to live, to participate. So there was a large Indian population in Singapore, which meant that there was an Indian district in the downtown business area where there were a lot of Indian shops and restaurants. And I absolutely adore Indian food. And the hotter, the better. If I can't feel my tongue or the inside of my mouth, except for the burning, that's what I like. Anyway, I love the flavors of Indian food. Anyway, so I would go down there to eat at the various restaurants that were down there because it was just fantastic. And next to one of the restaurants was a bookshop. And since everybody in Singapore they speak their heart language, Mandarin Chinese, or Tamil, or some Hindu dialect, or various Malaysian dialects, but everybody speaks English. They all get 12 years of English during their schooling. So everybody can speak English. And so I thought, well, maybe I can find something in here that will, that's written from an Indian perspective that's in English that would help me. And, there was all kinds of stuff in there. And there was some stuff that was in English, but the thing that I found that was the most helpful were a rack of comic books. And growing up, I lived on Superman and Batman and all the DC and Marvel stuff. Okay, so comic books, the whole graphic approach to it is just something I respond to really well. So I found comic books that had sections of the Ramayana and the story that's in and the Mahabharata in comic form in English. So you got these thought bubbles above the characters, and so you see, everybody in the dress, and you have to imagine it, so it's painted there for you, and then you can get the basic story. So anyway, now how did I get on that subject? Oh yeah, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are so popular, they have to produce all this popular material. It's not just theologians or scholars or really serious religious people who this is what is popular, and there's so much of it. They make movies about this and TV shows. It's anyway, Krishna, which is what I was trying to talk about here, is thought to be very delightful. He's full of playfulness, and especially playful pranks. And frankly, as he grows out of this stage here, he's good looking. He gets a little bit bluer in the depictions and other depictions as he gets older. Because blue is understood, has the symbolism of being divine somehow. But anyway, but he's seen as basically a ladies' man. You know, he's part of his playfulness is he's a womanizer. You know, and he basically he's kind of like an Indian cowboy in the sense that he really goes after the milkmaids, the women who are milking cows and to make butter and yogurt and all that kind of stuff, and cheese and different things like that. And so he's got quite a reputation. This guy gets around, and people don't mind. It's very, very popular. But anyway, but he's a delight. And Lord Krishna's promise to humanity is that he will manifest himself and descend to earth whenever Dharma declines. And this belief of his role and trust and faith in his role has sustained Hindu belief in the Supreme Being over thousands of years. So he's very, very popular. Matter of fact, back in the late 60s, before the Beatles broke up, my favorite musical group of all time, the Beatles went to India, and George Harrison, now deceased, but he was the one who was really got interested in Hinduism. And he wasn't a devotee particularly of Krishna. He eventually became a devotee of Kali. That was another deity. But he wrote a song, would have been in 1969, because I heard it on the radio in 1969 when I was at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, just north of Chicago, in basic training for the United States Navy. And I remember I had a little tiny transistor radio, and I remember laying in my bunk with an earphone in, listening to, popular radio, and George Harrison had a song that came out called "My Sweet Lord," and I was really interested in Christianity at that point. I was really exploring who Jesus was and trying to understand all that kind of stuff. And so I thought he was singing about Jesus, my sweet Lord. That's, people talk about the Lord Jesus all the time. So, he's talking about Jesus, until he got to the final chorus, which is Hare Krishna, praise to Krishna, worship Krishna. Hare Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Krishna, Krishna Rama, Rama Krishna. So he's referring to this. So that was my first exposure to both Rama and Krishna, was that song. Anyway, so that's avatars. Now there are also some non-human avatars, but these two are the ones that are probably the most significant and the most popular. All right, let's move on to Shiva, the destroyer. So, and look at the way this guy's pictured. First of all, wow, this guy works out. Looking pretty good. And we all play the look, don't look game. You can't help but look at where his hands are in his lap, and you're thinking, I shouldn't be looking there, right? That's just normal human modesty, or I am looking there, but I'll never admit that I'm looking there. But if you look a little bit lower than where his hands are in his lap, look what he's writing. Look what he's sitting on. He's sitting on what looks like a lion. So this guy is powerful the way he is portrayed. He's the destroyer. So Brahma is the creator, Lord Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the preserver, and Shiva is the destroyer. He is also extremely popular. The two most popular gods are Vishnu and Shiva. Because they have very important roles to play. So Shiva is the third member of the Trimurti, tasked with destroying the universe in order to prepare for its renewal at the end of each cycle of time. But Shiva's destructive power is regenerative. He destroys in order to give new birth. It is the necessary step that makes renewal possible. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to be reborn. You would just get to the end of your life, and then that's it. You know, just one life. But you need Shiva there to destroy your life so that you can be reborn. And that's what his role is in all of creation. Lord Brahma creates the world, creates the universe. Shiva preserves it, or excuse me, Vishnu preserves it, and then Shiva is the destroyer. He's also the Lord of the dance, the god, the avenger. So you need justice. This is the guy. I mean, I don't think I would be calling on Krishna, particularly in that cute little pose that we saw of him, you know, up here. You know, if I need vengeance, if I need somebody to stand up for me and to intervene in life, you know, I'm probably not going to be calling on Krishna. He might be a great buddy and full of laughs and all that kind of stuff. Might be good as a wingman going out to shop for chicks. You know, just being silly or facetious. But boy, if you need somebody who's really got power, who can bring about judgment, there he is. So, but that judgment, which results in destruction, is also the chance for a new life. So Hindus customarily invoke Shiva before the beginning of any religious or spiritual endeavor. They believe that any bad vibrations in the immediate vicinity of worship are eliminated by the mere utterance of praise, or of his praise, or of his name. All you got to do is just say the word, and that dispels the negative. Very, very powerful. Okay, let's take a look at some other gods here. That means this is not all of them, but it is some of them. So the one over here on, you're not seeing my arrow there. Okay, that's right. Okay, but anyway, top left-hand corner is Ganapati, also known as Ganesha or Ganesh. The removal of obstacles. This is the elephant-headed deity. He's actually Shiva's first son. Lord Ganapati, who has an elephant head, occupies a very special place in the hearts of Hindus, because they consider him to be the remover of obstacles. So, you know, he's, you know, whatever's in your way, he's the fixer. He can remove whatever obstacle that you're encountering in life. So, yeah, he has a real important, and people, you know, value and Ganesha, Ganapati Ganesha, very, very popular. You run into little images of them in people's homes, in their cars, on their desk. Even here in the United States, if you know, often you'll have someone, you know, if you take a Lyft or an Uber, well, you know, people often have stuff hanging from their, either on their dashboard, you know, in the car all day, you need something to, you know, to focus you or to remind you of something, or they have something hanging from their rearview mirror. Sometimes it's, you know, their tassel from graduation, because that's what they want to think about, is they have the horrible job of just navigating traffic and getting paid pennies to, you know, it's not the greatest most inspiring job in the world, to be a driver. So, people put up something in front of them they can think of, so they realize that they're not just a driver. Some people will hang a cross from their rearview mirror, or something else, or maybe it's just a little bobblehead that they put on their, I'm just talking about average people, right? They put on their dash just to kind of give them a sense of whimsy, something to smile at, right? We all do these kind of things. We decorate with what we're interested in or what pleases us. Well, if you get in very often, because there are an awful lot of people who are from Hindu extraction, Indian extraction, who are here in the United States. And so I've seen Ganesha on a lot of dashes. I've seen little versions of him hanging from rearview mirrors. Because boy, if there's any place you need a remover of obstacles, it's when you're in traffic. So nice to be able to envision that by seeing the representation. So very, very popular. Saraswati, now she's the goddess of learning, the goddess of knowledge. And you saw in the video that all the stuff that took place at the boys' school, all those ceremonies were for Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, and they had made a large image of her. And at the end of that whole celebration, they went and dunked the image in the pond. And the boys were out there swimming, and they were dunking the image, because they knew that the image was just made out of clay. Yes, there's this understanding that the deity comes and takes up residence in the image and sees you through the image, and you see the deity through it. But when you're finished with it, it's just a lump of clay, so they were getting rid of it. So that was a very playful, interesting time. Can you imagine if somebody walked into a church or a synagogue or a mosque or any other place and took some extremely important sacred object and took it out and threw it in a pond? What would be our normal reaction to that? We'd go, oh, but they didn't feel that way at all. It was really quite beautiful. I really enjoyed it. But that's Saraswati, very, very significant female deity. And female deities, hopefully I'm going to talk about in a minute, in general, can seem to be the power of the male deities, which is an interesting thing. Often people talk about the reason that women are so poorly treated in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is because God is seen as a male. God has a male gender, is addressed as a male, is imagined or understood to be masculine. And so that's why women aren't valued. Strangely enough, in Hinduism, the women have greater value. The female deities are where the men get their actual power. They're powerless without their female deities, without their consorts, without their partners. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yet Hinduism has a really low regard for women. So we have to come to get a different reason for what are they thinking? Well, it's not about the nature of deity. It's something else, which we'll talk about next week. Anyway, here's Lakshmi, the goddess of good fortune. Then you have to the right, you have Durga Devi, the restoral of moral order, or Dharva, another female, very powerful female deity. Then the bottom left-hand corner, you've got Indra, king of heaven, Lord of gods. Now, Indra is a very ancient, one of the very, very, very ancient deities. I mean, none of them ever go away, but Indra still maintains a real present focus for people. He's the king of heaven, the Lord of the gods. Surya, the sun, another ancient conceptualization of deity, of the sun, but very, very popular. Agni, the god of fire, the fire god. Agni is, clearly Agni, thousands of years ago, we whatever seemed beyond our explanation, we thought it was divine, magical, miraculous, supernatural. That's what we call it, right? And so fire was worshipped. It came out of the heavens, hit a tree, and oh my goodness, now we got fire. And and fire was important, and so Agni is the fire god. Then here's another example here of a more recent god, not recent like a couple hundred years, but last couple of thousand years, is Hanuman, the monkey god, the monkey king, and he's known as a devoted servant. Very, very popular. Matter of fact, if you visit Indonesia, which is predominantly Muslim, matter of fact, Indonesia, the 1,000 islands that make up the nation of Indonesia, there are more Muslims in Indonesia than there are in all of the Middle East. There are over 215 million Muslims in Indonesia alone. It's the most populous most populous Muslim nation in the world. So, most people in Indonesia are Muslim. But on Bali, which is this place where Westerners love to go because it's beautiful and it's a great vacation. The water is beautiful and clear. The weather is perfect. It's just an idyllic place. But in Bali, one of the more popular gods among the people who are Hindu who live there is Hanuman. He's the most popular god on the island of Bali. And I learned that from somebody who lived there for a number of years, who told me that. And then also, when I was living in Singapore, my religion professor from my graduate school came to Singapore on his way because he had promised to take his wife on a trip to Bali, but by stopping in Singapore and a couple other places and speaking at various institutions, and I invited him to come speak at the institution I was teaching at, he was able to write off part of his trip and get actually part of it paid for. So it made for he could afford to stay in Bali. And we talked about the fact that he was going to be seeing Hanuman. Anyway, so this is just a sampling of some of the other guys. You can go to these websites and see a whole lot more. And there's obviously a whole lot more. But it really helps to be able to get a picture of this stuff instead of just trying to imagine this stuff. All right, so let's continue on in our discussion of this concept of divinity. You see at the bottom of the screen here, it says the Trimurti. This is the Trinity that I was referring to. The Sanskrit word is Trimurti, this threesome. Lord Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer. And above it, I've got Brahman, who isn't a god. Brahman is. Brahman is being itself, not a being. And we normally think of Hinduism then as being having both monistic sense to it of Brahman, and the deities, the millions of gods, being manifestations of Brahman, expressions, emanations of Brahman. And we generally refer to this kind of messy system as polytheism, because the individual gods are theisms, right? They're beings. They are gods, they're God beings, not just being itself. And we normally call that polytheism. And that's a good description of the overall circumstances. But in reality, the concept that the average Hindu has is they're not worshiping all of these gods. They respect whatever manifestation of the divine they see. They respect it when they see it in another person, because another person has Atman in them, and Atman is Brahman. So that's this universal respect for life. And Atman is also in creatures and in everything that exists. Atman is being, right? But anyway, so, but they don't, you can't, it's just kind of like, you know, you may say, I'm interested in, I love, fill in the blank, male, men, or women. You know, whatever it is that you love, whatever it is you're attracted to. Well, there's a whole bunch, you know, there are probably 4 billion of each of those categories that if you want to pick someone to love in the world, and, you know, how are you going to worship? How are you going to relate to all 4 billion of them? How are you going to relate to 10 of them? That's impossible, right? It's just ridiculously impossible. But what you do is you pick one, and that becomes your companion, your mate. And the two of you essentially become one, and you are one with that person is one with you, one at a time. You know, I recognize that can change, but, you know, when you're making that connection, it's just the two of you. So that's what we would refer to as picking one out of the many, but it's not saying that everybody else sucks. It's just saying this is the one that attracts me the most. That's what happens in Hinduism. Hindus, from a practical standpoint, you can't worship Brahman. Brahman, you can't, how do you relate to something that there's no attribute to relate to? You can't. So you pick one of the gods that you're going to commit to, and you worship that god. And that's picking one out of the many. And that's what we refer to as Henotheism. So Heno means like first, second, third, and fourth. They're all contenders, but who's your first choice? And that's the one that you focus on. So when you talk to a Hindu and they say, well, how many gods do you worship? And they'll say, well, first of all, God is one. Now they're referring to Brahman. They're thinking that you're asking about Brahma. Well, Brahman is one, and Brahman, you know, that's the one, but you can't worship that. So their other answer would be when they say, oh, do you mean my personal connection? Yeah. Oh, that would be Krishna or Rama or Vishnu or Shiva or Lakshmi or whoever it is, right? You pick one and you give your devotion that one. This is what we refer to as bhakti yoga. We'll get to that next week. But that's what's going on here with all this. You cannot relate to all these deities, but Hindus, now in the West, we pick our god and we immediately attack the gods that other people pick that aren't ours, right? And we get into arguments, even among ourselves, about who's really God, and you know. And we, you know, and you'll hear these type of things, oh, they worship a false god. Hindus don't think that way. They're all everything is a manifestation of deity. So any god is a good thing. And so you don't diss it. You don't talk bad about it. You don't disrespect it. You respect the divine wherever you encounter it. But your personal connection is to one deity. Does that make sense? Hopefully nod your head if it does. Okay, I got a thumbs up. Thank you very much. All right, so that's what I'm trying to communicate here. So, Henotheism is probably the best description. In the vast array of gods, there is one god more powerful or more important. And typically, very often, they'll say Vishnu or Shiva, or someone related to Vishnu or Shiva. It's kind of like, you know, there's some sort of connection there. But so this is the idea. There isn't this exclusivism that exists in the rest of the world's religions where we say we're the ones who have the true God and everybody else is deceived, worshiping something false. Hinduism is very open-minded because everything is personal. You can't blame your circumstances on anyone else. Your circumstances, everything you experience in life that is good or bad, is the result of the choices that you've made in all your previous lives. That's karma. So you can't blame anybody else. And by the same token, so you just, it means that there's an openness. So when missionaries in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and the British missionaries primarily, there were other missionaries, Christian missionaries who got to India, and they came in and were talking about Jesus being God. That's what you expect them to talk about, right? And Hindus go, oh, this sounds very interesting. We will worship Jesus. And the missionaries at first probably got excited about this. Hey, you know, I talked to 10 people today. All 10 of them said, yes, Jesus sounds good. We should worship Jesus. Jesus sounds divine. That sounds good. Yes, I like this. This is really good. But they're not abandoning all the other gods. Of course, the Christian missionaries say, no, recognize that Jesus is the only God and all these others are false. Well, no. No, was basically the answer. No, that's not the way we think. This Jesus looks really cool. Yeah, we like him, and we'll respect him. We'll recognize the divinity that's in Jesus. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of understanding. It's a different way of viewing the universe, viewing reality. So divinity is found at many levels, in many forms, many values. And by and large, divinities that we can identify relate to life experiences. All right, there's one other thing here I want to talk about, and this is, nope, I'm going to have to save this till Monday because we're out of time. So I do want to talk about the female element, the feminine in the divine, because it is very important and very important. Your book talks about it, about Devi Durga as the great goddess, this whole idea of Shaktism. This is the female power and the importance of the female in the understanding of what is the divine manifestation in the universe. So we've already mentioned briefly Saraswati, but we're going to talk about Lakshmi and Kali and Parvati, Durga and Raja, and a bunch of others. But we'll do that next week.